Other cab drivers waited at the airport's luxury terminals. Businessmen, tourists, passengers who tipped well. Harold McKenna stood at the military terminal's concrete curb. That curb that scorched in summer and froze in winter. For 12 years, every single day the same spot. His meter always off. His wallet always empty. But in his eyes, there was a debt that had long surpassed money. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Soldier Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Harold McKenna was 74 years old, a taxi driver in Dallas, Texas. His world wasn't corner offices or retirement homes. It was a yellow 2003 Crown Victoria with 847,000 miles on the odometer, a vehicle that should have died years ago but kept running on stubbornness and duct tape, much like its owner. Every morning at 4:30 a.m., Harold eased himself out of bed in his one-bedroom apartment, joints cracking like gunfire, and made the same drive to Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. But he never went to Terminal A where the first-class passengers emerged with their designer luggage. He never went to Terminal B where business travelers hurried to waiting black cars. He never went to Terminal C where families reunited with hugs and tears of joy. Harold McKenna drove past all of them, past the money, past the tips, past the easy fares, and parked at Terminal D, the military terminal, the forgotten terminal, the place where chartered flights brought home the men and women who had given pieces of themselves to a country that often forgot to say thank you. His taxi was easy to spot among the others. While newer cabs gleamed with fresh paint and digital meters, Harold's Crown Victoria wore its age like a uniform, dense from decades of Dallas traffic, a crack across the windshield that he never bothered to fix, seats worn soft by thousands of passengers, most of whom had never paid a dime. On the dashboard sat a faded photograph in a cracked plastic frame, turned away from passengers, visible only to Harold. He never explained it. No one ever asked. The other drivers thought he was crazy. Crazy Harold, they called him at the dispatch office. The old fool who works for free. They didn't understand why a man his age would spend 12 hours a day driving wounded veterans to VA hospitals, to physical therapy appointments, to family reunions they couldn't afford to reach on their own. They didn't understand why his meter was always off, why he waved away every attempt at payment, why he sometimes sat in hospital parking lots for hours waiting for soldiers who had no one else to pick them up. What they didn't see was Harold's left hand, the one he kept on the steering wheel, fingers curled in a permanent grip. Two fingers were missing entirely, lost to frostbite in a place called Chosin, in a war that most Americans had forgotten. The remaining fingers were stiff, discolored, damaged beyond repair by temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero while Chinese soldiers poured across the frozen reservoir by the hundreds of thousands. What they didn't know was that Harold McKenna had once been Sergeant First Class Harold McKenna, 1st Marine Division, one of the chosen few. One of the frozen chosen who had fought their way out of the deadliest encirclement in Marine Corps history. 15,000 Americans surrounded by 120,000 Chinese troops. 17 days of hell in the coldest winter Korea had seen in a century. And Harold had walked out alive when so many others had not. He never talked about it, not to the other drivers, not to his passengers, not to anyone. The medals were in a shoebox under his bed, buried beneath old tax returns and forgotten utility bills. The discharge papers were folded in a drawer he hadn't opened in years. The memories were locked in a vault inside his mind, a vault with walls of ice that never thawed. But the debt remained. The debt he owed to the men who hadn't walked out of that frozen hell. The debt he owed to brothers who had died so he could live. Every wounded soldier he drove, every amputee he helped into his cab, every traumatized veteran he sat with in silence, that was his payment. That was his penance. That was the only way Harold McKenna knew how to say, "I'm sorry I survived when you didn't." The first time it happened, Harold told himself it was just a coincidence. He was waiting at Terminal D on a cold November morning when a chartered flight from Germany landed. The passengers who emerged were not the flag-draped coffins that came through Dover, but they were close. Young men and women in wheelchairs, on crutches, missing arms and legs and pieces of their souls. A medical evacuation flight from Landstuhl, carrying the wounded from Afghanistan and Iraq back to American soil. One soldier stood apart from the others. A young sergeant, maybe 25, with burns covering half his face and an empty sleeve pinned to his shoulder. He was looking around the terminal with the desperate confusion of someone who had expected to be met and realized no one was coming. His duffel bag sat at his feet. His good hand trembled. Harold approached slowly, the way you approach a wounded animal. "Need a ride, son?" The sergeant looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "I can't pay. My wife was supposed to be here, but..." His voice broke. "Meter's off," Harold said. "Where you headed?" The sergeant stared at him. "VA hospital, Fort Worth. But that's 40 miles, I can't." "Meter's off," Harold repeated, already reaching for the duffel bag. "Let's go." That ride changed everything. 440 miles, the sergeant sat in silence, staring out the window at a country he had left whole and returned to broken. Harold didn't push. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer empty words about sacrifice and gratitude. He just drove, steady and sure, the way he had once marched through frozen mountains with dying men on his back. When they reached the VA hospital, Harold helped the sergeant out of the cab and carried his bag to the entrance. The young man turned, tears streaming down his burned face, and tried once more to offer payment. "I told you," Harold said quietly. "Meters off." "Why?" The sergeant's voice cracked. "Why would you do this?" Harold looked at him for a long moment. Then he held up his left hand, the one with the missing fingers, the one that told a story he never spoke aloud. "Because somebody did it for me once. Long time ago. Only way I know to pay it back." Word spread among the wounded, not through official channels or social media posts, but through the whispered network that exists among soldiers, the invisible thread that connects those who have bled for the same flag. "There's a cab driver at DFW. Old guy. Yellow Crown Vic. He'll take you anywhere, no charge. Just look for the taxi with the cracked windshield." Within months, Harold's schedule was full. He was at Terminal D every morning when the medical flights arrived. He was at the VA hospital every afternoon when therapy sessions ended. He was at bus stations and train depots, picking up veterans who had no other way to get to appointments, to job interviews, to the funerals of friends who had finally lost their battles. He never advertised. He never sought recognition. He never joined veteran organizations or attended ceremonies or gave interviews. He just drove. Day after day, month after month, year after year. His cab became a sanctuary, a mobile confessional where young soldiers could sit in silence or pour out their hearts to a man who understood without needing to ask questions. Some days he drove in complete silence, respecting the need for quiet that only combat veterans understand. Other days he listened for hours as passengers told him stories they couldn't tell their families, described nightmares they couldn't explain to therapists, confessed fears they couldn't admit to anyone who hadn't been there. Harold absorbed it all, a sponge for trauma, a container for pain that others couldn't hold. His own family thought he had lost his mind. His daughter in Houston called every month, begging him to retire, to move closer to his grandchildren, to stop driving that death trap of a taxi around a city that didn't care about him. His son in California had stopped calling altogether, convinced his father was suffering from some form of dementia, unable to understand why a 74-year-old man would choose poverty and exhaustion over comfort and rest. Harold never tried to explain. How could he explain that comfort felt like betrayal? How could he explain that rest felt like abandonment? How could he describe the faces that visited him every night, the frozen faces of boys who had died in his arms 70 years ago, boys whose last words had been prayers for home and mothers and lives they would never live? How could he make anyone understand that driving wounded soldiers was the only thing that kept those faces at bay, the only thing that let him sleep without screaming? The other taxi drivers had stopped mocking him years ago. Now they watched him with a mixture of confusion and something approaching respect. They saw the way soldiers lit up when Harold's yellow cab pulled to the curb. They saw the hugs that lasted too long, the tears that flowed too freely, the salutes that passed between strangers who were not strangers at all. The first clue appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Harold was waiting at the VA hospital, parked in his usual spot near the physical therapy entrance, when a young corporal emerged on new prosthetic legs. The corporal was maybe 22, both legs gone below the knee, learning to walk again on titanium and carbon fiber. He spotted Harold's cab and smiled, a real smile, the first one Harold had seen on his face in weeks. "McKenna," the corporal called out, making his way carefully across the parking lot. "You're here." "Always here," Harold said, opening the passenger door. "How'd therapy go?" "Doc says I might run again someday. Can you believe that?" "Run." The corporal's eyes were bright with hope. "Hey, I gotta ask you something. One of the nurses inside, she said she recognized your name. Said her grandfather served in Korea, talked about a McKenna who saved his life. Any chance that's you?" Harold's face went still. The mask he had worn for 70 years slipped, just for a moment, revealing something old and wounded beneath. "Common name," he said quietly. "Lot of McKennas in the service." The corporal studied him. "She said her grandfather was at Chosin. Said McKenna carried him 3 miles through the snow with Chinese bullets flying everywhere. Said McKenna had frostbite so bad his fingers turned black, but he wouldn't put her grandfather down." Harold said nothing. His damaged hand tightened on the steering wheel. "She's inside," the corporal continued. "Nurse Rodriguez. She wants to meet you. Been looking for her grandfather's McKenna for years." "I need to go," Harold said abruptly. "Got another pickup. You need a ride or not?" The corporal hesitated, sensing he had touched something he shouldn't have. Yeah, I need a ride. Thanks, McKenna." They drove in silence. Harold's jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. Behind his eyes, the ice was cracking, memories seeping through fissures in walls he had built over decades. A frozen reservoir. body stacked like cordwood. The weight of a man on his back, a man named Rodriguez who had taken a bullet through the lung and couldn't walk, who had begged Harold to leave him and save himself. Harold hadn't left him. Harold had carried him 3 miles through waist-deep snow, through enemy fire, through temperatures that killed men where they stood. He had carried Rodriguez until his own legs gave out, until other Marines took over, until they reached the evacuation point in the helicopters that meant survival. Rodriguez had lived. Harold had lost 2 fingers to frostbite that night. He had never seen Rodriguez again after the hospital ship, had never known what happened to him, had spent 70 years wondering if the man he saved had made it home, had lived a good life, had found some measure of peace. And now Rodriguez's granddaughter was a nurse at the VA hospital where Harold parked his cab every day. The world was smaller than he had imagined, and the past was closer than he had ever allowed it to be. The second clue came a week later. Harold was helping a wounded Marine into his cab when he noticed a man watching from across the parking lot. The man was older than Harold, sitting in a wheelchair near the hospital entrance. He wore a Korean War veteran cap, the kind you could buy at any military surplus store, and his eyes were fixed on Harold with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. Harold tried to ignore him. He loaded the Marine's gear into the trunk, helped him into the back seat, and walked around to the driver's side. But he could feel those eyes on him the entire time, burning into his back like tracers in a night sky. "Hey, Harold." The Marine in the back seat was looking out the window. "That old guy in the wheelchair. He's waving at you." Harold glanced over. The man in the wheelchair had raised one trembling hand, not a wave exactly, but a gesture, a signal. The kind of signal that meant something to men who had served, a silent language that civilians never learned. "You know him?" the Marine asked. "No," Harold said, but his voice was uncertain. Something about the man's face, even from this distance, tugged at memories he had buried deep. The shape of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the way he held his head, tilted slightly to the left, compensating for hearing loss that came from artillery and mortars and the endless thunder of war. He drove the Marine home, made small talk, refused payment as always, but his mind was elsewhere, circling back to that parking lot, to that wheelchair, to that face that seemed to know him. The third clue was the photograph. Harold kept it on his dashboard, turned away from passengers, a private shrine to a past he never discussed. But one day, reaching for his coffee thermos, he knocked the frame to the floor. A young sergeant he was driving picked it up before Harold could stop him. "Whoa," the sergeant said, studying the faded black and white image. "This is old school." "Korea?" Harold snatched the photograph back, his heart pounding. Just an old picture. Nothing important, but the sergeant had seen enough. A group of Marines in winter gear, standing in front of a frozen hellscape. Young faces, exhausted faces, faces that didn't know if they would survive the next hour. And in the center, holding a rifle with hands wrapped in bloody bandages, a young man who looked remarkably like Harold McKenna. "That's you, isn't it?" the sergeant asked quietly. "Chosen Reservoir. I recognize the terrain from documentaries. My grandfather talked about that battle, said it was the worst fighting in Marine Corps history." Harold said nothing. His damaged hand trembled on the steering wheel. "You're one of the frozen chosen," the sergeant continued, reverence creeping into his voice. "Holy shit, you're one of them." "I'm a taxi driver," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's all. Just a taxi driver." The collision of past and present came on a rainy Thursday morning in April. Harold was parked at Terminal D, waiting for a medical flight from Germany, when a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the curb. This was unusual. Military flights came in on commercial charter planes, not government motorcades. Something important was happening. Harold watched as men in suits emerged from the vehicles, followed by a cluster of military officers in dress uniforms. Generals by the stars on their shoulders, admirals by the gold on their caps. The kind of brass that Harold hadn't seen in 70 years, the kind of brass that made enlisted men straighten their spines and hold their breath. And then from the last SUV, emerged a wheelchair. An old man, ancient really, with a blanket across his legs and a Korean War veteran cap on his head. The same man Harold had seen watching him in the VA parking lot. The entourage moved toward the terminal entrance, surrounding the wheelchair like an honor guard. But as they passed Harold's cab, the old man raised his hand. The procession stopped. "Him," the old man said, his voice cracked with age but carrying the authority of command. "Bring him to me." A Secret Service agent approached Harold's window. "Sir, could you step out of the vehicle, please?" Harold's heart was hammering. His hands, both the whole one and the damaged one, were shaking. He had spent 70 years avoiding this moment, hiding from recognition, burying himself in anonymity. And now, whatever was happening, whatever this was, he couldn't escape it. He stepped out of the cab into the rain. Drops pelted his face, mixing with something that might have been tears. He walked toward the wheelchair, toward the old man who was watching him with eyes that held 7 decades of searching. The old man studied Harold for a long moment, Then, slowly, painfully, he reached up and removed his cap. His scalp was bare, spotted with age, vulnerable. When he spoke, his voice trembled. "I've been looking for you for 70 years. Harold couldn't speak. His throat was closed, locked by ice that had never fully thawed. "You don't remember me," the old man continued, "but I remember you. I remember every step you took through that snow. I remember your voice telling me to hold on, to stay awake, to think about home. I remember your hands bleeding through the bandages, gripping me so tight I thought you'd never let go." The generals and admirals stood silent. The Secret Service agents watched with expressions that suggested they had been briefed on this moment, had been preparing for it. "My name is Thomas Rodriguez," the old man said. "Sergeant Thomas Rodriguez, 1st Marine Division. 70 years ago, in the frozen hell of Chosin Reservoir, you carried me 3 miles through enemy fire with 2 bullets in your leg and frostbite eating your hands. You saved my life." Harold's knees buckled. He would have fallen if a young officer hadn't caught his arm, steadied him. The rain was coming down harder now, plastering his thin hair to his skull, soaking through his cheap jacket. "Rodriguez," he whispered, the name tearing out of him like something that had been trapped for decades. "Tommy Rodriguez. They told me you died. On the hospital ship. They said the infection." "They were wrong," Rodriguez said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I lived, because of you. I went home to my wife, raised 3 children, saw my grandchildren born. I've had 70 years of life because you wouldn't put me down." Harold was shaking now, violent tremors running through his body. 70 years of walls, of silence, of careful anonymity, crumbling in a rainy airport parking lot. "I looked for you," Rodriguez continued. "For decades I looked, but you disappeared. No forwarding address from the VA. No contact information. It was like you vanished. I didn't want to be found," Harold managed. I couldn't. "I know," Rodriguez said gently. "I understand now, but I had to find you. Before I die, I had to tell you what you did, what it meant." He gestured to the generals and admirals surrounding him. "Do you know who these men are?" Harold shook his head, unable to focus on anything but Rodriguez's face, the face he had last seen blue with cold and contorted with pain. "They're my sons," Rodriguez said, "and my grandsons. Admiral Thomas Rodriguez Jr., United States Navy. General Michael Rodriguez, United States Army. Colonel David Rodriguez, United States Marines." Harold looked at them, really looked, and saw Rodriguez's jaw, Rodriguez's eyes, Rodriguez's bearing repeated across 3 generations of military excellence. "Because you saved me," Rodriguez said, his voice breaking. "I went home and raised a family of warriors. My sons have served in Vietnam, in Desert Storm, in Afghanistan. My grandsons have commanded ships and battalions and expeditionary forces. Hundreds of lives they've touched, thousands of soldiers they've led." He reached out with a trembling hand and took Harold's damaged fingers, the fingers that had turned black carrying him through the snow. "It all goes back to you, Harold. Every medal, every mission, every life we've saved. It goes back to a young Marine who wouldn't leave a wounded brother behind. It goes back to you." The terminal doors opened. Doctors and nurses from the VA hospital were streaming out into the rain, drawn by the commotion, by the motorcade, by the rumor that something extraordinary was happening in the parking lot. And there, at the front of the group, was a young woman in scrubs, Nurse Rodriguez, the granddaughter who had been searching for her great-grandfather's McKenna. She approached Harold slowly, reverently, the way you approach a saint or a monument. "Mr. McKenna," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandfather talked about you every day of my childhood. You were his hero. You were our family's hero. We named my brother after you, Harold Rodriguez. He's a Marine now, because of you." Harold couldn't speak. The ice inside him was melting, flooding him with emotions he had suppressed for 70 years. Grief for the men who had died, guilt for surviving when they hadn't, and now something new, something warm, something that felt like absolution. Admiral Rodriguez stepped forward. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who had commanded fleets and made decisions that shaped history. He straightened to attention, his dress uniform immaculate despite the rain. "Attention on deck," he said quietly. Every military officer present snapped to attention. The generals, the colonels, the young officers who had accompanied the motorcade. They formed a line in the rain, medals gleaming, faces solemn. And then, as one, they raised their hands in salute. Harold stood frozen, a 74-year-old taxi driver in a soaked jacket, being saluted by 3 generations of warriors, by admirals and generals and colonels, by the living legacy of a single act of courage on a frozen mountain 70 years ago. Behind them, the VA hospital staff had gathered. Doctors and nurses, many of them veterans themselves, stood at attention. Patients in wheelchairs and on crutches had made their way outside, drawn by something they couldn't explain, something that pulled at the part of them that still remembered what service meant. They were all saluting, every single one of them. The rain poured down and Harold McKenna wept. Thomas Rodriguez, with great effort, pushed himself up from his wheelchair. His sons moved to help him, but he waved them off. This he had to do himself. On legs that had almost been lost to a Chinese bullet 70 years ago, legs that Harold McKenna had saved by carrying him through hell, Rodriguez stood. He was unsteady, he was ancient, but he stood, and then he saluted. Not the crisp salute of his sons and grandsons, but something older, something that came from a time before precision and protocol. A salute that said everything words could not. A salute that bridged 7 decades and closed a circle that had remained open for too long. Harold's hand moved on its own, rising to his brow. The damaged hand, the one with the missing fingers, the one that told the story of Chosen. He returned the salute with a grip that had carried a dying man through snow and fire and impossible odds. They held the salute for a long moment, 2 old men in the rain, surrounded by the family and the legacy and the living proof of what one act of courage could create. When Rodriguez finally lowered his hand, he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "This man," he said, gesturing to Harold, "has spent the last 12 years driving wounded veterans for free. No payment, no recognition, no expectation of thanks. He has driven thousands of miles, spent thousands of hours, given every penny of his meager income to serve soldiers who remind him of the brothers he lost." He paused, overcome. He did it because he thought he owed a debt to the men who didn't come home from Chosen. But today I'm here to tell him the truth. Rodriguez looked Harold directly in the eyes. "The debt is paid, Harold. It was paid the moment you picked me up in that snow. It was paid with every step you took, with every finger you lost, with every nightmare you've suffered in silence. The debt is paid." Harold shook his head, tears streaming. "It's never paid. It can't be paid. They died, Tommy. All those boys, they died, and I lived." Rodriguez interrupted firmly. "You lived, and because you lived, you saved me. And because you saved me, my children lived. My grandchildren lived. Every soldier my family has led, every life we've touched, exists because you made a choice in the snow." He gripped Harold's shoulders with hands that had known strength once and still remembered it. "You are not a debtor, Harold. You are a creditor. The world owes you. And today, finally, we're going to start paying it back." The ceremony at Walter Reed Army Medical Center was small, private, the way Harold wanted it. No press, no politicians, no spectacle. Just Rodriguez, his family, and the hospital staff who had come to know Harold's yellow cab as a symbol of quiet service. They presented him with a plaque, a formal recognition of his volunteer work, 12 years of dedication to wounded warriors. They presented him with letters from soldiers he had driven, testimonials that filled 3 binders, stories of how a silent taxi ride had saved minds and sometimes lives. And then Admiral Rodriguez stepped forward with a wooden box. "This wasn't easy to arrange," he said. "The Battle of Chosin Reservoir was 70 years ago. Most of the paperwork is lost. Most of the witnesses are dead." He opened the box. Inside, on a bed of velvet, lay the Silver Star. "For gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States," the Admiral read from the citation. "Sergeant First Class Harold McKenna, under intense enemy fire and despite severe wounds, carried a wounded comrade 3 miles to safety through sub-zero temperatures, directly contributing to saving his life and demonstrating extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming odds." Harold stared at the medal. His body was trembling. "I can't. I don't deserve." "Yes, you do," Rodriguez said from his wheelchair. "You've deserved it for 70 years. And now, finally, it's yours." The Admiral pinned the medal to Harold's jacket, a cheap jacket that had never worn anything but rain and road dust. The silver gleamed against the worn fabric, a star that had waited 7 decades to find its home. That night, Harold drove his yellow cab home for the last time, not because he was retiring, but because Rodriguez's family had bought him a new one. A brand new Crown Victoria, yellow like his old one, but with heated seats for his aching bones and a meter that would remain permanently off. On the dashboard, they had installed a new photograph beside the old one. A photograph taken that afternoon in the rain. 2 old men saluting each other, surrounded by admirals and generals, surrounded by the legacy of a single act of courage. Harold parked in his usual spot at his apartment complex. He sat in the dark for a long time looking at the 2 photographs. The frozen young men of 1950, the weeping old men of today. The line that connected them, unbroken, unbreakable. For the first time in 70 years, Harold McKenna slept without nightmares. And the next morning at 4:30 a.m. he drove to Terminal D, because the debt might be paid but the mission never ended. Because somewhere, a wounded soldier was waiting for a ride. And Harold McKenna, Silver Star recipient, chosen survivor, taxi driver, would be there. He would always be there. Moral of the story: the greatest debts are not paid with money but with service. And sometimes, the ones who give the most are the ones who believe they still owe. If this story moved you, don't forget to show your support. Please subscribe for more soldier stories. We bring you true tales of courage, sacrifice, and honor. Stories that remind us of the quiet strength carried by those who serve. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the heroes among us.